In this scene, Leah says some things to Han that he might not have wanted to hear. But she expresses to him some negatives to his personality that might make her reticent to want to be romantically involved with him. And this is slightly humorous and a whole lot more humorous than the text we're going to be looking at today. But it's kind of the same idea. One of you told me that this is the passage in Romans you didn't want to hear, or the one you didn't like. And I would say probably in today's culture, the passage we're looking at today is the one people will find most troubling because of the things Paul has to say about the wrath of God. And that's something we don't like to think about. But here's the thing about the gospel, the good news. It's a message of redemption. That's the good news, that there's redemption out there. But before we can receive this message, we have to come to terms with the bad news that we need redeeming. And that's the thing that we struggle with in our culture and in sharing the gospel, because we live in a culture that thinks that the way you deal with your sin is to convince yourself that it's not there. There's nothing wrong with you. You are perfect the way you are. You should never change. You are exactly everything you should ever be. Well, if we're convinced of that, then why would we need Jesus to do anything for us? So before we can receive good news, we have to come to grips with the very bad news that we are indeed broken, that we are indeed fallen, that we are indeed worthy of eternal death. We don't want to hear that. But until we recognize that, Jesus has nothing to do for us. So today we're going to start with the bad news. But just know that we had to start here before we could get to the wonderful good news. And that the reason for the bad news is to prepare us for the good news. It's not an end in and of itself. For God to address us as sinners worthy of eternal death is not to say that He does not love us, and is not to say that our lives are pointless and we've already blown it. That's not at all what God is trying to do. So keep that in mind as we look at today's passage. And let me ask you to stand out of reverence to the Word of God. And let's read together the passage we're going to be considering today. It's in Romans chapter 1. We'll be looking at verses 18 through 32. And please read out loud with me. For God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of humans, who by unrighteousness are suppressing the truth, because the known things of God are plainly to be seen among them, for God has revealed them to them. For the unseen things of Him, both His eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood through what has been made. So they are without excuse, for, having known God, they did not give God glory or thanks. Rather, they became futile in their reasoning, and their foolish heart was darkened. Claiming to be wise, they were made fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image in the likeness of mortal man, or of birds, or of four-footed animals, or of reptiles. Therefore, God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts to the filth of dishonoring their bodies amongst themselves, these who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the thing created rather than the one creating, who is blessed forever. Amen. Because of this, God delivered them over to dishonorable passions. For their females changed the natural usage to one contrary to nature. Likewise, the males also, leaving behind the natural usage with females, were consumed with their desire for one another, males accomplishing the shameless act with males, and receiving in themselves the necessary reward for their delusion. And since they did not approve of keeping God in mind, God delivered them over to a debased mind to do what is not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, treachery, mean-spiritedness, rumor mongers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, braggarts, inventors of evils, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, without mercy, who, although they know God's righteous decree that those doing such things are worthy of death, not only are doing them, but they also approve of those doing them. Thank you so much. You may be seated. I've titled our message today, First, the Bad News. Because, as I said, we need the bad news before we can understand the good news. So Paul has described the gospel as the power of God for salvation. And I think this first section is going to cover the idea of God's power and where we see it at work. The first thing that Paul tells us we see God using his power to do something about is wrath. God exercises wrath against sin and acts based on that wrath in the world. That's the first evidence of God's power to salvation. It begins with wrath, believe it or not. And the second thing he's going to discuss about the power of God being revealed is his righteousness. And that's the thing that he's bringing in through the gospel, because his wrath is awakened by the problem. But that's not where he leaves it. He moves to the offering of his righteousness, of making right what is wrong, what has provoked his wrath. So those are the two first big sections we're going to work through here in the letter to the Romans. And we start with wrath. For God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of humans. These two words kind of point in two directions. The first word we translate there, ungodliness, is asebayon. The word sebo can mean worship or devotion, the appropriate attitude of devotion that you would have toward God. And he puts before it, kind of becomes a negating particle or prefix. So rather than the proper devotion and worship that you would show to God, it's the total lack of that. It's none of that. The word I've translated ungodliness. The other word is adikayan. And decay means dike, or D-I-K-E would be the way you transliterate it. That means right. So you put before that, and you end up with not right. And that deals with how we treat each other, the things we do to each other that are not right, that are worthy of censure in our behavior. So Paul is saying that God's wrath is awakened from heaven against all of the things that are wrong in our relationship with him, as well as all of the things that are wrong in the way we are operating in the world, with each other, with creation itself, with everything around us. The ways in which we are interacting are not right. In fact, he says that this not rightness of us humans is having the effect of suppressing the truth, hiding the truth. It creates confusion and deception and all forms of darkness that cloud the human mind so that we are in a state of utter confusion in the world. This is the result of our rejection of God and our hostility in sin towards God and towards each other. I had somebody in Sunday school today telling me that they can hardly watch the news anymore because it's all so hostile, right? Our politics. In some ways, I hate election years because it's all people talking about why this other person is the worst person in the world and why you should not vote for them but vote for me. And then the other person is saying the exact same stuff about the other one. And it just gives you this sense of, right? And this unrighteousness has pervaded life on earth. And philosophers raise a big objection to God. And they call it the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. I think the problem of evil is a better way to define it. But if God is all-powerful and all good, then why is there evil in the world? If he's all good, then surely he hates evil. And if he has all the power in the world, why doesn't he just get rid of it? Surely he could do that if he can do anything. Well, it turns out that he is all good and that he is all powerful. And in fact, he has done something to fix the problem of evil. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next year. He has established a means of restoration, the gospel. So it isn't, the complaint against God is that somehow he's off who knows where, ignoring all the pain and suffering we are experiencing down here on earth. You have no idea what you're talking about if that's what you think God's up to. God's not off somewhere ignoring us. He is very much involved. And you think evil bothers you? You got no idea. God's response to it is much more powerful than ours. His indignation at the very presence of sin in creation is much higher than ours. And it's really rich that we would shake our fists at God about the problem of sin when we're the ones doing it. God is tremendously offended by sin, and his response to sin is wrath. And you may say, well, that's kind of bad. Well, no, it isn't. Because if God ever gave up on that, if God stopped being the one who hates sin, if he himself embraced it, then all hope is lost. Because he was the only one that would have power to fix the problem. And if he succumbed to sin, if he didn't hold the line, if he said, oh, this little bit is okay, that's how sin started. It's just a fruit, right? What's the worst that could happen? Well, several thousand years later, or who knows, I don't know the chronology exactly, but apparently eating that fruit could result in some pretty bad stuff. God responds to sin with wrath, and it's right that he should do so. If he didn't, there would be no hope. He's the only one that could do something about it. And we don't want God to fudge. We don't want God to bend the rules. We don't want God to become like us. He has to remain absolutely righteous, or he cannot fix it. So his response to sin, the problem of sin, is wrath. Paul's going to try to work through over these next couple of chapters how it is that all of us have fallen under this wrath. Every one of us. Now, this first section we're looking at today really focuses more on the life of the non-Jew, the person who knows nothing about the law of Moses and who is a pagan, who worships idols and is involved in all the kinds of things that pagans are involved in. But you'll notice Paul is already in this passage seeding things that have direct ties to the Jews as well. And I'll point that out as we work our way through this. Because he's later going to focus on the Jews who think they're much better off than the pagans, to tell them, I'm sorry, but you guys are in the same boat. You guys are in the same problem. We are all under this wrath. But let's talk about the pagan, the person who has never seen a Bible, never heard a word of Scripture, never been told anything about the Bible. Surely God can't be upset with them. They didn't know any better, right? And that might be our way of thinking. And Paul says, well, no, not really. And here's his reasoning. Because the known things of God are plainly to be seen among them. Now, Paul's not saying that everything that's to be discovered about God is plainly available to anybody. You just open your eyes and boom, there it is. No. But he says that there are things that God has made known about himself, and he has done so in a universal way. He has exposed every human being to some information about himself. Not all of it, but enough that we are required as created beings to respond appropriately to what he has let us know about himself. Does that make sense? For God has revealed them to them. For the unseen things of him, both his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood through what has been made. This is the idea of natural revelation, that God reveals something about himself just through the nature of what exists. And think about it. These attributes, he says, his eternal power and divine nature. When you look at the world around you, hopefully you marvel at the wonder of how everything fits together. And we can devote ourselves to studying any aspect of creation. We can go to the microscopic level. We can become doctors and physicians and look at the human body and marvel at how the human body functions, how every system in the body keeps the whole body alive and thriving and working well. And we can study the universe and study the stars and the planets and the way things work and be amazed at the precision. It's like clockwork, the way the whole universe functions. And sooner or later we have to stop and say, who made it work so well? Why does it all fit together so perfectly? And the more we study about our own planet and the things that were necessary for us to even exist, it's like winning the lottery, only a whole lot harder than that. We get to the realm of probabilities that are so infinitesimal, you can just say it's impossible. For the axis of the earth to be at just the right angle, and the distance of the earth from the sun, and the speed of the rotation, and the presence of the moon, and its distance from the earth, and its size, it all had to be precise, or we would not be here. As far as we know, this is the only oasis of life in the universe. I love science fiction, but the scientists tell me that there is zero evidence there's anywhere else any life could exist, that anything like us could be anywhere else. And God has made very clear. We look at that and you have to say, it would take somebody a whole lot more powerful and a whole lot smarter than me to do something like that. It would take God to do something like that. God's divine nature is woven into the very existence of the world. It would take God to make something like that. Now, here's what I would say to you. Chaos, if there is no God, chaos makes sense. But if there is no God, how do you explain order? Why does it fit right? Why does it continue to act the same way? Why does it follow the same patterns? Why can we even talk about the scientific method? Why does it always follow the same pattern? There's no reason to assume it should. It could just be chaotic. It could be different every time. You could float up or fall down, or there's no reason it has to be a certain way. And why does everything from the atomic level forward follow these patterns? So that we can have things like engineers, and we can calculate stresses and tolerances and structures and build things like skyscrapers and bridges and airplanes and things that actually work. Because somebody put it together. Not only that, but somebody has been maintaining it in perfect working order from the moment creation began. So not only the divine nature of God, but his eternal power. As far back as we can go in human history, the ancients, whatever they've left behind for us of their observations about the planets and the stars, it all fits what we know. It's been working the same as long as there's been humankind. Because God is there, He designed it, and God has maintained it in operation from the moment it started. Now, when we're children, we kind of instinctively resonate with that. We have no trouble believing that God put it all together. But as we grow, we begin to convince ourselves, no, it's just coincidence. We just happen to be the luckiest creatures in all creation. It all just happened to work out for us. And it just happens that I have this intellect and the ability to think, and I have a soul and the ability to know what beauty is. And that I can have meaningful connections that are much more than just chemical things. That I can create something like art or music. Yeah, just coincidence. That we tell ourselves that. As we grow, we block God out of our world and find another way to explain everything. But Paul says, God is shouting out to us, here I am. Here I am. And Paul says, even people who've never heard the Bible have heard that voice. And what's the response of humankind been? So they are without excuse, for having known God, they did not give God glory or thanks. So God shouts out to us, here I am, and we say, Because we understand, if God made us, then that means our purpose in life might not be what I want, it might be what God wants, right? It might be the guy who made me. He might be the one who gets to call the shots. But if nobody made me, then I'm God. At least of my life, right? And I get to do whatever I want with this. And that's, for some reason, is very appealing to us. And we very quickly figure out ways in our minds to shut God out and to establish ourselves as the little gods of our lives. So the response is God's shouting, here I am, and rather than seek Him, rather than turn to Him in gratitude and give Him glory for what He has done, we pretend He's not there. We pretend He's done nothing for us. Rather, they became futile in their reasoning, and their foolish heart was darkened. And here's what we do. We start using our minds, this mind God gave us, and we start rationalizing our choice to shut God out. And let me tell you, there's a difference between reason and rationalization. Reason is about pursuing truth. Rationalization is about misusing intellect to justify what you want. And we're much better at rationalizing than we are at using reason. So we begin to think, and our reasoning becomes pointless because we don't come out of our reasoning with anything that's going to help at all. And what happens is our hearts get caught up by foolishness. The root of that word foolish is moros, from which we get the word moron. Sophomore? Sophia is wisdom, moros is moron. A sophomore is a wise fool. You're kind of in the middle there. So the foolish heart, our hearts were foolish, and the heart being the center of the will, the core of who we are, and it becomes darkened. I think that really describes the process of going from early childhood to adulthood. Isn't there a darkening of the soul where we're a whole lot less trusting as we grow and a whole lot less open to the numinous and the mysterious and the wonder that was so easy when we were children? We become better, it seems, better thinkers, but the way we use our minds ends up darkening our souls. Claiming to be wise, they were made fools. and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image in the likeness of mortal man, or of birds, or of four-footed animals, or of reptiles. And Paul is clearly here talking about idolatry. And this is what the ancients had done. They didn't give God, the God, glory. They said, no, let's figure out who we want to be God. What do we want God to be like? Let's invent stories, and let's create a narrative that we like, and let's create images that we can focus our attention on, and let's paint them or make statues of them. And what are we going to draw on to make our gods? Well, they'll either look like us, they'll look like human beings, or maybe they'll look like animals, or maybe we'll mix them and we'll put a bird head on a human body, or, something like that. Let's just make up something awesome and say, this is God, and let's give our devotion to these things. And Paul says, the immortal God is calling to us. And in response, we have said, no, not that, this. And all we have set up as the object of our devotion is something created. Some corruptible, mortal thing created. And we fashion these things. And of course, the idols simply become a tangible expression of the human desire to set up anything as the object of our heart's devotion other than God. And idolatry is alive and well in the world today. It's alive and well in our country. There are plenty of people who have chosen something created to give their hearts and devotion to that is not God. It's the process Paul's describing here, creating gods in our own image. Now, here's where I'm saying Paul is preparing the way for his words to the Jewish people after this, because this sounds like a flat-out description of pagan idolatry, but he's actually playing with something that the psalmist says in Psalm 106, verse 20, where he's talking about the Israelites when they were in the wilderness and they built the golden calf. They exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. This is not just a problem of the pagans. It's a problem Israel has struggled with throughout its history. And Paul's kind of seeding his discussion, moving to the Jews later. Therefore, so how does God respond to this? What is God's punishment? Paul says that God's wrath is revealed from heaven, right? How is it revealed? How are we seeing God's wrath at work? How is God involved in the world today? Therefore, God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts to the filth of dishonoring their bodies amongst themselves. These who exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped it and served the thing created rather than the one created, who is blessed forever. Amen. Because of this, God delivered them over to dishonorable passions. Paul begins his discussion of the wrath of God by talking about sexual immorality. And you might say, why start there? And I'll say he doesn't stop there. He goes on to a whole other slew of things that are evidences of where our hearts have taken us and where God has let us go. And by the way, that's how he describes his wrath being made evident, in the fact that he has actually taken hands off and said, okay, go for it. That's the expression of God's wrath. But why focus on sexual sin? Well, I think Paul indicates something interesting about sin that has to do with sex. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. There's something mysterious about sex, something about the act of sex that involves body and soul in a mysterious way, and that is profoundly impactful on the human person. I think that's why the New Testament and the Old Testament as well makes so much of this, because this is a particular flavor of sin that digs roots in deep to our hearts. and begins to shape our minds and even our concept of identity in ways that can just overtake our whole life. Is that not an observed reality in our world today? Are there people not out there who define themselves primarily by what they do sexually before they define themselves in any other way? For some people, that has become the core issue of their existence. So I don't think it's surprising that Paul points this out as a starting point in his discussion of God's wrath being poured out. And here's how God has poured it out. He has handed people over to the cravings of their hearts. You really want this? God has said, okay, have it. That's his wrath. And here's the thing, God didn't curse us with these things. God just stepped back and let us make them up. We invented them. We designed them. We came up with them, with these patterns of sexuality that are damaging to us and to the world. But God has allowed us to pursue what we wanted. Because, and here's the reason God has allowed this, because we rejected him and focused our hearts on the creation rather than the Creator. We decided, I am not going to live as one created by somebody to whom I must answer for my existence. I reject that obligation. I reject any obligation to God. I cut God out, and I will make up my own God. I will decide what God is. Because we have made that choice, God has said, okay, have your God. Do what you want. And make no mistake about it, that is an act of wrath. If your kid wants to play with knives, you'd have to be really angry to just say, okay, go ahead, right? You would step in and take it away. Paul said, this is the ultimate expression of God's wrath, that he has stepped back and said, okay, pursue what you want. I will allow you to do it. And it's bad news. And Paul's very explicit about this. And here's the thing, there's tremendous pressure in our culture today for us to embrace homosexuality. And not just that, a whole series of sexual activities that go completely contrary to the biblical teaching on sexuality. And let me tell you this about the biblical teaching about human sexuality. It has never corresponded to the norm of the world. Never. It's not like back when this was being written, everybody was living the way they were supposed to. The problems we have today, the things people want to do today and want to be validating, and we've been, as humankind, we've been doing these things forever. And all along God's been saying, no, that's not right. That's not the way it's meant to work. But Paul is very explicit here. Their females changed the natural usage to one contrary to nature. Likewise, the males also, leaving behind the natural usage with females, were consumed with their desire for one another, males accomplishing the shameless act with males, and receiving in themselves the necessary reward for their delusion. Paul is saying that, and he identifies both, female homosexual activity and male homosexual activity, and defines both of these as evidences of God's wrath, of God stepping back and saying, do what you want to do. And Paul does define sex as the natural function of sex to be one man and one woman. And if we look at other passages where Paul's talking more specifically about what we should do as opposed to what we shouldn't, sex is meant to be a sacred thing within marriage that binds together a man and a woman in a very mystical and spiritual and powerful way, and deepens their love for one another so that they become the appropriate candidates for parenthood. And sex is not just about having babies. It's about having the kind of parents babies need. It's about binding together two human hearts. So don't be neglectful of it, married people, because it's part of the union of marriage that God intends for it to be, and it's a good and sacred and right thing. But homosexuality is contrary to that. It's contrary to the nature of how God designed us to function. And Paul very clearly identifies it as something that is shameful and not according to nature. I know these are hard things to hear in a world that has made such a priority of convincing us that this is noble and good and right. But the Bible tells us it's shameful and wrong. And I don't mean to offend anybody, but the Bible also says this about a whole lot of sins. Greed is shameful and wrong, and self-centered living is shameful and wrong. There are a whole slew of things we are all drawn to that are not right. This just happens to be one that our world has very strongly tried to erase as a sin. And since they did not approve of keeping God in mind, God delivered them over to a debased mind to do what is not fitting. And these are the end results of this. And here we see a whole pattern of behavior. And remember, I was talking about the Jews who weren't idolaters. They didn't worship statues. But I'll bet any Jew reading this list is going to hit a couple of things along the way where they might say, "Ooh, ouch, that one kind of hit me." Maybe as you're listening today, I don't know, it may be that you're a person that struggles with homosexual desires. I'm not telling you to pretend like that's not the reality in your life. I'm just saying don't surrender yourself to that as your identity. Any more than if I have a problem with greed, I would surrender to that as my identity. I would say, I'm a person who struggles with this. Help me. But I trust that God can work out in me a different approach to living. And I don't have to do anything that I want to do, anything that I'm drawn to do. I can be free from those things and live in a different way. But these are results of God stepping back and saying, okay, you don't want me? Well, then have whatever you wanted. You don't want me? Have what you want. And the result is that we become filled with all unrighteousness, everything that is not right. Wickedness, covetousness, that's looking at what somebody else has and greedily wanting it for yourself. It's not yours. It's not rightfully yours. It can be somebody else's wife. It can be somebody else's job. It can be somebody else's house. It can be their car. It can be a talent. It's something that is not rightly yours, but you want it. Covetousness, malice. We've all experienced that. If you think you haven't, try to think back to the last time somebody cut you off in traffic or took your parking space when you had your blinker on. And we know what it is to wish another person ill, to have malice in our hearts, full of envy, murder, strife, constantly fighting, arguing, being combative about things. Treachery, mean-spiritedness, rumor mongers. Some translations say gossips. I liked rumor mongers better. It was in the lexicon, and I thought that's a better word. Where we just can't wait to tell people the latest juicy tidbit we've found out about so-and-so. Some people just delight in this, and even those who try to resist the urge, we fall into it, don't we? Just sharing stuff about other people that isn't necessarily helping the other person in any way, it's just entertaining us. Rumor mongers. And sometimes we take it further than that and we misrepresent. We become slanderers. We twist the truth a little. Haters of God, insolent, arrogant, braggarts. We get so full of ourselves and so defiant. And nobody else is as smart as we are. And nobody else deserves our honor. God himself doesn't deserve our honor. Inventors of evil, we become so clever. Any teenager who's tried to figure out a way to do something their parents would not allow them to do, and you come up with this whole scheme. Certain people have to make phone calls at certain times, and you have to get certain people on board to do this or that. You plan the whole thing out because we are great inventors of evil. We can put our minds to work and come up with some pretty amazing stuff. Disobedient to parents. You might think that's an odd thing to throw in this list. You know why our children need to learn to obey and honor us as parents? It's not about our egos as parents. It's not about us needing to be treated in some special way. But our children need to learn what it is to submit to rightful authority. Because if they're ever going to come to saving faith, if they're ever going to come before God, the only way to do that is on your knees. The only way to come before God is in surrender. And we're trying to instill that in our children. We tell them they have to obey and respect us because we are modeling for them what it looks like to walk with God. We respect him, we honor him, and we submit ourselves to him. So one sure evidence that a person is heading in the wrong direction is if they can't even show obedience to the parents that gave them life and have sheltered them through life. Senseless. Covenant breakers. You make a promise, you agree to something, you break your promise. Heartless, without mercy, who, although they know God's righteous decree that those doing such things are worthy of death, not only are doing them, but they also approve of those doing them. There's this sense that this isn't right. There's something off about this. There's something worthy of censure about this. But rather than draw back from it, people lean into it. They push forward. They say, no, what we need to do is not draw back. We need to make everybody agree that this is great. Isn't that a picture of the culture we live in today? Now, the fact the world is the mess it is, the fact families are falling apart left and right, the fact that children are growing up in chaos in our country today is that God, in his wrath at our rejection of him as the rightful object of our devotion, has stepped back and said, okay, you guys come up with stuff and do it. I'm going to let you. I'm going to let you do what you want to do. And the result has been the disintegration of the family. The result has been chaos. The result has been so much pain. So many children have been the victims of the things their parents have decided to say, this is right, this is good, this is great. We haven't gotten to the rest of it, but I'm not going to stop there. There is good news. And the whole reason God does this, the whole reason God applies his wrath and says, okay, hands off, have at it, is that God is allowing us to discover for ourselves that sin is not good. You see, as long as he just puts his hand on top of us and prevents us from doing anything, we might still think, well, if only God would let me do it, it'd be great. God says, okay, let me let you taste it yourself. Do it. Go for it. I know what's going to come from that, because sin can only breed death and devastation and ruin and destruction. I'm going to let you taste it in your own flesh. I'm going to let you experience it firsthand. You see, God's wrath has a redemptive purpose. The reason God wants us to experience the suffering that our sin is going to bring on us is that we're so foolish, we're so darkened, we're so oblivious that until it hurts enough, we won't even realize we have a problem. That's why the wrath of God is a good thing. We need to come face to face with the reality of our sin and this pattern of living centered on self with defiance towards God, where my life is mine to live and I'm going to do what I want with it and God can just deal with it. That approach to life is going to bring pain to you. And the reason God's allowing that is that He wants to rescue you. He wants to free you from that. And until you want rescue, He can't do anything for you. Until you want to be released, He can't release you. He's not going to impose this on you. You're going to have to want it. So His wrath, the wisdom of God, is to allow us some measure of living out what we want to do in defiance against Him. So that as we begin to reap the rewards of this, we might say, you know what, sin said, I was told going into this that it was going to be awesome. It was going to be great. It was perfect. It was everything I want. And yet, now that I'm ankle deep, now that I'm neck deep in this, I just want out. I hate it. It's not at all what it was promised to be. That's what God's up to with His wrath, is He's giving us the opportunity to come to grips with the reality of our sin so that we are at the point where we can be saved. You can't be saved until you know you're drowning. And that's the good news, that God's wrath is driving us to His mercy. It's driving us to His open arms. He's just waiting for us to turn around and come back. We're going to sing a song of invitation. I'd like to ask the musicians to come forward. And as we're singing, I want you to ponder this. Are you one of these people who have just surrendered your heart to God and said, okay, God, I know I'm a mess. I know that my twisted way of thinking and my reasoning has darkened my heart to such a degree that I can't even trust myself. But God, You are righteous. You are good. And I can trust in You. I'll surrender my heart to You, and I want You to just work in me rescue from sin. Work in me a transformation of heart and mind so that I become able to rightly appreciate what is good and what isn't, and to rightly live life in a way that is not leading to destruction and devastation, but that is leading to life and honor and glory and everything worthy of praise. If that's you this morning, I want you to come forward during this time of response. We'll have people here at the front, and just share with them your commitment to God this morning, and let them pray with you and encourage you. Let's all stand. Please come while we sing.